Hello everyone. So in today's video we will be seeing Kubernetes Roadmap. It is a complete step-by-step learning path for admin and developers. So let us see some slides and let us see what is Kubernetes Roadmap and how we can learn it for admins and developers. So let us start. First of all, why learning Kubernetes is a good idea. Kubernetes has become the operating system of the cloud. It is also pronounced at K8s and is being adopted at companies at a higher pace, and anyone with knowledgeable or anyone with knowledge of Kubernetes in this time has a very good career advantage in this. This also reflects on the job market, where Kubernetes job searches grew by 25% in 4 years, and this high demand for engineers who have a good knowledge, a better knowledge of Kubernetes, have resulted in great career opportunities and higher salaries too. Okay, most popular Kubernetes related tech roles include DevOps engineer, okay, software engineer and cloud engineer. You can see cloud engineer, software engineer and DevOps engineer. Okay, next is Kubernetes is very complex and very powerful also. So let us see Kubernetes administrator versus user, and let us see some most important point to consider about them. So here are the most important point to consider when you start learning Kubernetes, which will make your learning journey much easier and more efficient. It is to understand the following. Kubernetes platform, like almost all other platforms, has two sides or aspects of it. The administrator side first. Someone needs to set it up, initialize, configure all the required parts to prepare it for its actual uses, and that is what administrator side is. Okay. Next is the user side, or you can say platform user side. And now what happens when administrator is like setting up, initializing, configuring all the required things? So someone should be there to use it. Someone will now start actually using it, deploying application and services inside it. And just like with AWS cloud platform or Jenkins platform, for example, we have to set it up, like we have to create an AWS account, install Jenkins services, we have to configure the access, install or activate any plugins needed or services, secure the platform to make it usable, and so on. And once it is done, all accesses are given. Engineers who need to use platform, these types of platform, would create the pipeline on Jenkins, and they will then deploy their application, okay, on AWS platform. So then, are you an application developer? If you are, so you should have a fundamental concept, like you need a roadmap to learn how to use Kubernetes to deploy application and run application inside the cluster. So if you are an operation engineer, if you are an application unit engineer, you should have some fundamental concept that apply to both developers and administrators. Okay, so we have established that we have these two separate learning paths. However, before branching off into a specific path, there are fundamental concepts that apply to both developers and administrators. Understanding the why, and the most important entry point to learning any technology or tool is learn the why behind the technology first. What problem does it solve that made Kubernetes so popular and widely used? The whys of how Kubernetes helps solve issues of operating large containerized applications. And once you have understood this, why Kubernetes or what problem it solves, then you can learn how it actually solves those problems and actual implementation of the tool and how the tool works. Next is architecture of Kubernetes. So once you have initialized or established the why, and you can dive into the core components and architecture of Kubernetes. As part of Kubernetes architecture, you need to understand and learn about the control plane and worker nodes. What is the role of each? How are they connected? What processes are running on them? Like learning resources, all are there in the YouTube description. You can check that. Next is core objects of Kubernetes. After that, you need to learn the core building blocks of Kubernetes, which are Kubernetes components. You need to understand what is a pod, service, ingress, config map, secret, deployment, stateful set, namespaces, and volumes. These are the main Kubernetes components. Understand why each one exists and what are their relations and connection to each other. Next is how K8 or Kubernetes works behind the scenes. Here are some Kubernetes components. You can see scheduler, control manager, etcd, and API server, which is also present in control plane. And next is Kubernetes kube proxy, container runtime, that is present on node part. These are the components like scheduler, controller manager, as I said, etcd, API server, kubelet, kube proxy, container runtime. Even though you may have little to do with this directly because they just run in the background, not in front end part. So they do work in the cluster in groups, and still understanding these components, what each one of them does and what each role does they play, will help you understand how Kubernetes works. So when you do things in a cluster, when you administer it or run application inside, knowing what is happening in the background from the Kubernetes perspective will definitely make it very easier for us to work with Kubernetes. Okay, so how to work with Kubernetes? This is all theory, right? So now we should understand the architecture actually, how Kubernetes performs or works. Okay, and this will give you a different level of confidence with the tool if you do some hands-on on that and kind of break the fear, whatever fear you are having to use the Kubernetes services. It will just break down all those fears. Next is accessing and interacting with Kubernetes. So how you can access and interact with Kubernetes? So this is kubectl, API, and K8's cluster. So with a good understanding, with a good concept of fundamentals, now you can shift your focus to understanding how to access and work with a Kubernetes cluster, kubectl. Now this is basically control panel kubectl, and this is API, and then it is connecting to cluster. You can say Kubernetes cluster. As part of this, you need to learn command line interface first, which is kubectl, which is very much essential for interacting with our Kubernetes cluster. Okay, next is creating component, updating them, troubleshooting and viewing components, and analyzing. We have to learn all those things. Next is Kubernetes manifest file. Additionally, here in example configuration file for a deployment of configuration, it is given here. Before that, let me tell you something, that you also need to learn about Kubernetes manifest files as part of Kubernetes basics. These are Kubernetes YML configuration file which describe the desired state of your application within the cluster. Again, I am repeating, Kubernetes YML configuration files describe the desired state of your application within the group or cluster, you can say Kubernetes cluster. So whenever you use this to define what Kubernetes components like deployments, services, stateful sets, and so on, you want to create this in the cluster and configure, and you have to configure it. You want those components to have, you have to configure all those components. And here is an example of that configuration, like API version, apps /v1 kind, deployment, metadata name, NGI inks, deployment specs, some specification like selector, match labels, app is ng inks, min ready seconds 5, template, metadata, labels, app, and this is basically a configuration file. Next comes the troubleshooting part. As you progress in Kubernetes journey and start deploying applications inside with manifest files and kubectl and start creating various Kubernetes components, you will definitely encounter challenges and issues in the process that requires troubleshooting skills. So you also need to learn kubectl commands for troubleshooting as well as other ways of getting insights into cluster and what is going on with your components, like getting insights into cluster networking, the component configuration, the runtime environment of your application, and so on, like check container logs, check cluster status, check node and pod status, and next verify networking. So this is how troubleshooting is an essential skill you will need to practice in order to work with Kubernetes. Next comes learn about common Kubernetes misconfigurations. It is not very much opinionated now when you learn how to create components and run various services on Kubernetes. Now you will notice that you will have Kubernetes as a very powerful and very flexible platform, and it is not very opinionated, and you can do a lot in the cluster, so it gives you a lot of flexibility. But this also means that you can do a lot wrong, like misconfiguring things with bad practices, and we should follow some good practices. Common misconfiguration will actually help you a lot. Knowing from the start what are some things that people without experience in Kubernetes may misconfigure, things that are not really logical or intuitive, and where people mostly make mistakes. We found out easier to start with some wrong practices because that is how we can learn explicitly what not to do before learning about the best practices, what to avoid, and importantly why to avoid them. We can learn that. So these are basically we should learn about some misconfiguration that that will give you some knowledge that what you don't have to do in for future while working with Kubernetes. Here is Helm chart. This is an advanced topic, and Helm chart, especially as you start deploying third-party services in your cluster next to your application, you will have to learn Helm chart, like what is Helm, what are Helm charts, what are they used for, how they make working with Kubernetes and deploying different services easier, and so on. Okay, again with same approach, first you have to understand, and then you have to work on them, and you have to see that how we can use them. Okay, next is self-managed versus managed Kubernetes service. First, start by understanding different ways of operating system, different ways of operating Kubernetes cluster, like self-managed and managed Kubernetes service, which are offered by AWS EKS, Azure AKS. So this, you have to understand some pros and cons of each one of them and differentiate between self-managed and Kubernetes as a service, and this will help you informed decision about how to operate Kubernetes cluster for your specific organization or your engineering teams. Networking in Kubernetes, how we can do some networking in Kubernetes. This is a very important concept you need to learn as a Kubernetes administrator to do your job effectively. Is networking in Kubernetes. Networking plays an important role, okay, which allows you to communicate within a cluster, and these are some concepts like ingress, network policies, pod-to-pod communication, pod-to-service communication, Kubernetes network interface, you can also say K8s-NI, network plugins, cluster DNS services, and so on. Okay, and these network concepts is very much important to you whenever you are managing, or whenever you are you want to administer a self-managed Kubernetes cluster. You must have these concepts with you while troubleshooting and fixing network, because if you don't know these concepts, troubleshooting or fixing network might be difficult for you. Okay, Kubernetes does a lot of these out of the box without much effort and configuration needed from administrator, which is very good. Cluster access management. Okay, there is another essential responsibility of a Kubernetes administrator that you need to explicitly configure and set up. Whenever you need to set up properly with best practices, you should follow some best practices. And basically, who can do what in the cluster is basically what cluster access management is. Okay, in simple terms, it is who can access what. Like admin can access what, limited access, you should give some users some limited access, you should have some good access to admin. So these all things you can set using cluster access management. Next is data management and data backups. Okay, what is this? So You will also need to take care of data backups in Kubernetes. Whenever you are working with Kubernetes, you need to make sure to have a proper mechanism in place to easily recover your cluster in case of a disaster, because suppose it might happen that your data might be lost sometimes. So you should have some backup data with you, and you need to understand application data, understand the concept of volumes and how data is plugged into the cluster services through volumes. K8's cluster configuration data. Apart from the application data as it is written here, you also need to understand etcd, which is a data storage, basically a data storage for cluster of Kubernetes configuration data itself, and you need to understand what is stored inside, how to backup and secure etcd store with all its sensitive cluster data, securing secret data for various cluster applications. Next is Kubernetes applications. Okay, Kubernetes operators. Kubernetes operators is basically the service itself bundled with the intelligent logic of operating that service automatically within the cluster. As a Kubernetes admin, you also need to learn the concepts of Kubernetes operators whenever you are deploying something, some very complex application like databases in your Kubernetes cluster. You will come across these operators. Okay, elastic or logic of operating elastic, you are saying here. So instead of human interference or intervention of setting up, initiating and maintaining that service, you can automate operator and it will does all of the things by itself only. Okay, next is monitoring K8's cluster. So to have insights that what is going on into your cluster, you need some monitoring stuff, and it is very your job, like you can say it is your job as a Kubernetes administrator to take care of configuring and setting up monitoring on a K8's cluster level. You can't manage and administer or fix what you can't see, so you should monitor all these things. You should have insights of all the things, and one of the most popular tools for monitoring is Prometheus. Okay, Prometheus basically can monitor what is going inside your Kubernetes. Okay, and when you deploy a monitoring stack including Prometheus alert manager and all the components that come with it, you will be able to deploy it with a Kubernetes operator. Okay, next is some best practices, what you have to do, some do's things, and generally for all above the administrator task, you need to learn the best practices as well, not just any way of doing it and configuring it so that it works, but the best way of operations and security in Kubernetes is do's. Okay, and so that is basically your roadmap if you want to become a good Kubernetes administrator and learn that aspect of the platform. Okay, so I hope this was very clear to you, this video was very much clear to you, and I hope now you can use this to find your way in Kubernetes, and this is what Kubernetes administrator roadmap was. So thank you, and let us meet in our next video.